The more things change, the more they stay the same. Respect is something that is becoming more and more elusive as time moves forward. Everyone wants to be heard, admired, or otherwise accepted. It's really only natural. I say this not wanting to come off as holier than thou, but it's important to at least acknowledge other people unlike us exist. And you shouldn't treat other people as any lesser than you are due to factors outside of their control.
They judge me before they even know me. That's why I'm better off alone.
But don't think for a second I'm only talking about minorities when I say that. All too often, we forget that the majority of people we see all around us tend to be not much better off than we are. It leads to an overall lack of empathy, where people perceive you to be privileged over factors that are considered advantageous. It's to the extreme where social justice is being turned on its head, and you have minorities feeling justified in being disrespectful towards those viewed as having it better than them. And this is a massive reason as to why I tend to not respect internet discourse. A lot of it is one side trying to scream over the other, as if the opposing perspective doesn't deserve to be heard, much less respected. I apologize for front-loading this video with such an opinionated diatribe, but I just cannot express enough how sick and tired I am of this me-first mentality that permeates our everyday lives. And the Deltarune Fandom is only a macrocosm of a greater issue surrounding discourse on the internet, where you're treated as less of a human being over something like calling Kris by the wrong pronouns, regardless of the logic you use to justify it. For those of you unaware, a prevailing opinion in the Deltarune Fandom is that Kris is non-binary. And some people get genuinely offended when you call Kris either a boy or a girl. Not all of them. We're really only talking about a fraction of people who care enough to actually show an attitude over it, but for as few of them that actually exist, they're all the same, no less deranged. Yeah, let's just get this out of the way. I do not respect the logic that the Deltarune Fandom tries to push regarding what Kris is. All it ever boils down to is that if you do not use they/them pronouns when addressing Kris, you're a horrible person who hates non-binary people. And it's one of the most blatant examples of sour grapes I've ever seen. Ignoring the fact that Kris as a person is not actually real, she's not being affected at all by me calling her whatever I want to call her, and I would obviously have very different standards when addressing a transgender or non-binary person in real freaking life. The Deltarune Fandom, for whatever reason, takes Kris's identity extremely personally. Wherever you adopt their viewpoint, or you're just an absolute scumbag. I'd settle for something as minor as, Kris goes by they/them pronouns because they're two people sharing one body. No one in universe would have to know that, they just do it out of respect. But people in the real world who may not even agree with your politics or worldview would do it because it's a genuinely creative idea that gives Kris's pronouns a double meaning. After all, they and them typically refer to multiple people, not just a single person unless their gender was unknown. But no, people typically don't even want to extend that, with some even going on these long-winded, sanctimonious rants about respect and bigotry.
Okay, so that's how it's gonna be. Y'all wanna play?
I guess it's just better to perpetuate a culture of most people not even knowing what the heck you're talking about, as opposed to actually educating people on your cause. You see, these people do not care about coming to any type of mutual agreement. They just want to say their piece and not be questioned, nor do they even care to try and help others rationalize why what they want should be accepted beyond feelings. Even if what they're trying to communicate to you legitimately cannot make any sense in your mind. Imagine being a math teacher and grading an answer as wrong, not because the student got the wrong answer, not because the student refused to show their work, but the work shown didn't match the way you wanted them to learn it. As long as they came to the correct answer and the way they worked it out makes sense, what does it matter how they got there? This attitude of learning the right way not only stifles creativity, it's elitist. And for full disclosure, I not once have ever told anyone that they were wrong for thinking that Kris was non-binary because of the pronouns that she's addressed by throughout the game. And you wanna know why? Because I'm not dogmatic, that's why.
Look, I'm not the one with the problem, okay? It's the world that seems to have a problem with me.
Remember, this is a minority we're talking about. And the minority is the party with something to prove. This type of toxic argumentation does nothing to improve how other people see you, which is a problem when you're the one who's actively seeking approval from others. And I'm sorry, I do not think that Kris exclusively being referred to by they/them pronouns is evidence enough to suggest that she's non-binary. See, here's the problem. The exclusive use of they/them pronouns is too freaking subtle. Yes, I am aware that Kris has a rapport with her friends and neighbors prior to the events of Deltarune, and she's able to exist entirely independent of the soul. Unfortunately, I find it to be a moot point because contrary to what some of you would like to think, they/them pronouns don't stand for anything. They at most complement he/him and she/her, but using them as a substitution is not intuitive. And the evidence for this can be found by the fact that so many people on the internet call Kris a boy. Masculine pronouns are like hot dogs, while feminine pronouns are like burgers. By comparison, gender-neutral pronouns in the case of they/them is like ketchup. As in, though it's edible, it's typically used to make something else taste better. This is the problem you run into when you're using terminology that complements what's mainstream as if it works to substitute what's actually common. It's going to fly over the head of the average person, and they're not going to be capable of interpreting that. Obviously, going too far in the opposite direction is also bad, but it's arguably less so because at least it's undeniable what the intent actually is. Ideally, you want to find some type of middle ground where it's recognizable to a more general group of people, but not in your face where it's still respectful. If you can't manage that, well then don't be surprised when people continue to call Kris a boy. After all, people have used words like man, bro, and dude regardless of gender for millennia. Of course, that's assuming that making Kris non-binary is what Toby actually intended, which none of you know for a fact. Yes, I know the elephant in the room, we'll get to that later. But the reality is we don't know for a fact if that's the case. And given the fact that Kris is a silent protagonist in the game, which encourages a lot of unnatural dialogue decisions, and B, it's a work of fiction. They/them pronouns are obviously a stylistic choice that helps the player to relate to Kris better. Having a pre-established personality does not make it invalid to project what you want on the character you're playing as. Especially when Kris's gender has not once ever come up whatsoever throughout the entirety of the first 4 chapters. So before you comment pointing out the fact that Kris is addressed with they/them pronouns as evidence of being non-binary, understand that that argument means quite literally nothing. No one in their right mind would respect it. That's also where the advantage of calling Kris a girl comes in. There is no mistaking what she is, because being assumed male is the mainstream. However, my logic doesn't start and end with being contrarian. I'm also not oblivious to this elephant in the room. I know what you're thinking. But Toby himself says that Kris's pronouns are they/them.
Kris, can you reach it?
He's stuck in a
He's stuck in a cutscene.
Yeah,
You can't do it.
Kris cannot reach
You
it.
can't do it.
They're stuck.
So no, you're not slick, you're just straight up wrong.
Objection!
Ah yes, let's talk about the fact that the Deltarune fandom actually relies on Toby Fox's word, which is outside the confines of the game that he created, instead of exclusively relying on what they could pull from inside the game itself. Listen, I don't want to dismiss what Toby Fox has said to be stubborn, but I do beg the question as to how much weight people really want to put into what Toby has to say on the subject. I mean, to start, if the weird route is any sign, people don't really care what Toby's original vision is, and would sooner infantilize him over apparently miscommunicating his storytelling, instead of recognizing that an allegory isn't literal. But also, a piece of media should be able to stand on its own. If people cannot interpret what you meant based on what's presently in the work, then your arguments are no more valid than headcanon. And it doesn't mean that anyone is wrong for having a perspective different from Toby, especially if they can back it up with empirical evidence within the game itself. There's a literary criticism known as death of the author, which essentially means that every one person's interpretation of a creative work is just as valid as the person who created it. Unfortunately, it seems a lot of people cannot really tolerate that I have my own reasons for thinking Kris to be a girl, even though at least in my mind, it seems fairly inoffensive. So what did I actually do? I pointed to the fact that Kris's church clothes had the buttons on the left-hand side, which is common in women apparel. A fact that clearly a lot of people have never heard of before, because reactions to this being brought up were either dismissive or even aggressive because they just did not respect it, even though it's actually consistent with other characters in the game, like Carol's coat also having the buttons on the left-hand side. And some food for thought, the Godmaker has a vessel torso where the buttons are on the right-hand side, and another torso doesn't have any buttons at all. Toby could have easily just dropped the buttons on Kris's church clothes and there'd be no problem here whatsoever. But he didn't. Hey, if you're gonna use pronouns as your evidence, this is mine. Pot, meat, kettle. Bear in mind, I did not start playing Deltarune until after chapters 3 and 4 were released. So I don't have the 6+ years of hindsight that everyone else already has, now with condition of to think that Kris is non-binary. I don't have to jump through any hoops to come to this conclusion. It's called subtext, and it allowed me to perceive this fact as evidence to back up my claim. And I wouldn't even bother taking the piss out of this if the fandom in question wasn't so possessive over what people wanted to call Kris. I legitimately cannot fathom why it matters so much that one person wants to call Kris a girl, to the extent that y'all truly took to heart Susie's behavior in Chapter 1 where she says that your choices don't matter. Speaking of Deltarune's weird route, you should know that a lot of my comments that I showed in this video came from this video, where I talk about the now censored Wilted Rose that used to be in Chapter 4. Amongst those comments, there was a lot of confusion when I talked about how a lot of the Deltarune fandom has a problem with displaying bigotry towards straight people. With that being said, allow me to break it down in the last reason why I do not respect the logic that Deltarune fandom likes to push. I always found it alarming that for as many people love to talk about Kris being non-binary when it's convenient for them, those very same people tend to be pretty freaking quick about scapegoating heterosexual people when it comes to the weird route in Deltarune. In case you're out of the loop, a lot of people read into the weird route of Deltarune romantic undertones between Kris and Noelle, essentially saying that Kris is forcing Noelle into a heteronormative relationship where Kris is an abusive boyfriend and Noelle is the submissive girlfriend. I think they're wrong for a variety of reasons, but that's not really relevant right now. This legitimately pisses me off, because in the context of the weird route, what does sexuality even really matter? It's disingenuous to act as if toxic queer relationships don't exist. Why not just say a toxic relationship and leave it at that? Why specify a heteronormative if Kris isn't even male? Let me put it this way. If Noelle was straight and Susie, instead of being a girl, was now a boy, and throughout the weird route, Kris, who keep in mind is still gender ambiguous, is grooming Noelle into a relationship with them, taking her away from her heterosexual crush, I guarantee you people will look at that and think it's blatantly transphobic. Because minorities hate being portrayed negatively in media, and the LGBT community would see that as the player indoctrinating queer ideology into Noelle, all the while theming it as abusive. In addition, this makes me question whether or not people who actually see Kris as non-binary actually believe that she is. The heteronormative idea is entirely unnecessary, like a spoon of honey to make a bitter pill easier to swallow. And by extension, it says to me that not even you believe that Kris is non-binary, because you're unwilling to take the good with the bad regarding what we can force Kris to do. For that matter, why would I respect a community of people that actively hate people like me, where they demand acceptance and acknowledgement, all the while failing to acknowledge how this could come off to others that don't already agree with them? If anything, it feels really freaking vengeful. Especially when you consider you'd avoid this problem entirely if you interpret Kris to be a girl like I do. Because Noelle is a lesbian, and considering some of the memories that she actually has with Kris, an argument could definitely be made that they have actual chemistry. And it isn't like only heterosexual couples have wedding rings either. I mean, Noelle herself remarks that if Susie were to get her a ring, at the bare minimum, it's something that she at least thinks about. But this idea that Kris is playing the role of a very toxic boy, forcing Noelle into a relationship she doesn't want to be a part of, it if anything serves the erasure of toxic queer relationships actually existing. Which is really a crying shame, because if people want equal rights, they should be ready for equal fights too. That's why I put what I did after I called this crap out. Because more than anything else, it proves that these people do not actually care about social justice. No, what this could adequately be described as is social vengeance, where you're trying to elevate a minority by putting other people down. Which, I'll be real, it feels really unfair. To say nothing of the fact that a lot of people in the Deltarune fandom should know full and well how it feels to be discriminated against. And unlike Kris, who's a fictional character and obviously wouldn't feel any pain whatsoever, and let's be real here, some of you can afford to be less parasocial with these characters as well, I'm a real-life human being. Do my feelings not matter because I'm a straight man? Am I not allowed to feel offended at this blatant discrimination that actively throws people like me under the bus? And why should I be expected to listen regarding what Kris's pronouns are, when some of those very same loudmouths who try to shove this down my throat wouldn't respect it when it's inconvenient for them? You want change for the better? Be a better person first. Because change only happens when you decide to make it happen. Let this be my final message in this video. If a difference in worldview over something as insignificant as Kris's pronouns is enough to get you to unsubscribe from me, your subscription was never worth anything in the first place. So go ahead and unsubscribe. We can agree then that we're better off not knowing each other.